That's okay. I'd like to call the Gurnee Village Board Committee of the Whole meeting for November 28th, 2016 to order. Roll call, please, Andy.
Thorstensen.
Yes.
Balmas.
Present.
Hood. Wilson. Here. Ross.
Here.
Garner. It's 4 present, 2
All
absent.
right. Trustee Garner will be joining us in a few minutes. This is Committee of the Whole, so it's informal. Tonight is a discussion about and a presentation on our multi-year financial forecast and our fiscal contingency plan. So,
Sure.
Brian? Or
Yeah.
no, Pat's going to kick it off?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, just quick, so last year we had our first formal multi-year financial forecast that Brian put together, so went through and updated it this year. Not going to get as in-depth on the numbers, because everyone's familiar with it, having it a year underneath our belt. So he'll run through that, and then we'll run through the fiscal contingency plan. So that is new, so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Sent the 4-page policy out Wednesday of last week, so Brian will run through that, and then we'll talk through, what'll happen, when the plan will be triggered, and then what the staff's response was, and the village board's responsibility and such. So I'll kick it to Brian. He's got a PowerPoint that he's going to walk us through. Like the mayor said, it's informal, so if you have questions that come up along the way, just feel free to interrupt Brian, and we'll get those answered.
All right, thank you, Pat. As Pat mentioned, we're second iteration, so I won't get as deep into the numbers and assumptions and things like that. We'll try to stay at a high level here. So tonight we'll talk about the forecast, kind of the purpose and objective, some of the questions that the forecast is intended to answer. Prior year key decisions, we made some decisions last year in regards to debt and some things like that we'll talk about. We'll review those, look at last year versus forecast and how we finished, see if we need to change any methodologies or assumptions, and then new threats and opportunities, and then a little bit on financial projections, and then we'll wrap that up. I got a couple slides on pensions. Excuse me. Just a brief refresher on that, how they're funded and some assumptions that go into it, and then we'll talk about the fiscal contingency plan. The multi-year forecast, that's the first step in our planning and reporting process. This leads into the capital plan, then the annual budget, which is the detailed plan at the line item level, and then quarterly status reports, and then the audit is the final look back on the report for the year. So we're at the beginning of the process. The purpose of the forecast, it's a long-term planning tool. It is a best practice by GFOA and ICMA. Helps establish capital funding. As you know, the village does not levy a property tax, so it helps us confirm long-term sustainability of funds and services, and make sure we can identify any threats to that early on. Helps us do some what-if analysis on different scenarios. It is obviously made of a bunch of assumptions. It's a projection of potential outcomes. It's not an absolute. It's constantly changing, and in no way is this meant to replace the budget. This is set an exercise to get some general direction going into the budget. So it's absolutely not a replacement for that. Some of the key questions we hope to answer: can we sustain operations long term? Can we continue the capital program as outlined in the multi-year capital plan? Is there any new threats and opportunities to fiscal sustainability? What's the impact of a potential recession or some of the things we've seen in the past on fund balance? Should they occur in the future? And then what is the potential impact of an economic downturn? The structure of the forecast stayed the same. We'll look at a 5-year history, a current year estimate, and then a 5-year projection. For major general fund revenues, we look a little bit further back at about 15 years back, and we forecast those based on 3 scenarios that we'll talk a little bit more about. The funds included are the general fund, the bond fund almost by default, and the water and sewer operating fund, E911 fund, MFT, capital improvement fund, and water and sewer capital. So anything with an operating or a capital impact here is what we're looking at. Last year during the forecast discussions, there was some key decision points. The board gave some direction to staff on that. The first was, how are we going to use the proceeds from the debt service rolling off? And we determined that 100% of the Series 2012, which came off last year, will be dedicated to capital, and then the Series 2009, which rolls off in fiscal year 19, we would try to dedicate 50% of that to capital. We were able to do that last year through a transfer of surplus at the end of the year, so it wasn't in the budget document because we had some surpluses. We were able to do it earlier than projected, so hopefully we'll be able to do the same thing this year. Also last year we talked about a multi-year water rate plan in conjunction with some difficulties with funding capital and infrastructure replacement for the water and sewer fund. We implemented a multi-year plan, 5-year plan that goes through 2021. Also put together a strategy to fund some capital and infrastructure improvements in the water and sewer systems through a drawdown of fund balance and then another transfer from the general fund to the water and sewer capital fund only through fiscal year 2021. At that point, the hope is that the rate will be at such a point where it can sustain operations and some capital and infrastructure needs, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that point. Just looking at where we finished last year, here we were really just looking to test our assumptions and methodology, see if there's anything we needed to change. Major revenues, these 8 major revenues here, finished the forecast pretty close to actual, about 0.5% off. So we thought we were pretty good at forecasting the major stuff. When we look at the general fund in total, again, did a great job forecasting the major revenues. Probably could have taken a little deeper dive into the non-major revenues and done some more forecasting on that. There was things like ambulance services and eye drop collections and things like that made a huge variance at the end of the year that we didn't pick up in the forecast. And the bottom line is the difference here shows how conservative we are with the forecast assumptions. I think, as I said before, the forecast is a document and an exercise to give general direction. So it's good to stay conservative with those assumptions and actually beat the forecast assumptions quite handily here with the variance at the end of the year of over $1.1 million. So threats this year to fiscal sustainability, just quick review, state budget. It's always out there. Remember a few years ago we had some threats to our income tax receipts. So it's something we'll keep an eye on. Healthcare costs, we're looking at an 11% increase in fiscal year 2018. We talked about that a few weeks ago at that renewal. So it's something we need to keep an eye on. Pension costs, we've seen double-digit increases here over the last 3 years, largely due to lowering an assumption in the interest rate, and we added some staff in both police and fire. At the federal level, the election's over, and there's plenty of things that were talked about that could have a local impact. Monetary fiscal policy could have an impact on interest rates, could have an impact on infrastructure funding. Changes to the tax code, obviously, if that puts money in people's pockets, that could have an impact on sales tax generated here locally. And then the Affordable Care Act, there remains to be seen what will happen there. On the opportunity side, 911 consolidation we've been talking a lot about gives us an opportunity to become more efficient in that arena and also achieve some economies of scale. The East Grand Corridor we've also talked quite extensively about. Doing some things there that could expand the tax base. Again, without a property tax, it's important to keep that retail base moving. The Gurnee Process Innovation Committee. This is more of an internal thing, looking at how we can be more efficient with internal processes. And then, just as it is a threat, it could also provide an opportunity, changes at the federal level. Real quick, how we modeled major general fund revenues. We did 3 scenarios, a baseline model that just hopes to capture that long-term growth trend in economic cycles, an expansion model that looks to capture an expanding economy continuing on, and then a contraction model that hopes to capture what a recession might look like somewhere between the 2001 and 2008 recession, followed by some years of expansion there. So that's how we modeled the major general fund revenues. Looking at revenues in the general fund, sales tax has flattened dramatically over the last, say, 18 to 20 months. We are currently, through October, 1% behind last year, but still 1% ahead of budget. We anticipated some of that drop during the budgeting process and budgeted conservatively. Income tax, a bit of a mystery this year. The village uses an IML estimate. We actually take the IML estimate and be more conservative than that estimate, but it's still down 12.5% from last year, and the Illinois Municipal League is actually in talks with the Illinois Department of Revenue on why that is. So we hope to get some information on that here in the next few weeks. Those are the 2 largest major general fund revenues, so it's definitely important to keep an eye on those and where those are headed. Amusement tax seems to be on target. Food and beverage, bright spot, up 6% versus last year, continues to be strong. If you remember during last year's discussion, we noticed that this was one of the more recession-proof taxes that we have. Continues strong performance even through that. Looking at hotel tax, down 5% versus last year. Telecommunications tax, no surprise here. We've known this is steadily sliding for a few years now. Use tax, another bright spot, up 3.5% versus last year. Seems like primarily due to some online retailers voluntarily remitting. Hopefully that will continue and maybe even see some legislation helping push that. And then building permits up 26% versus last year. We've had some development that has driven those numbers, but a lot of that is one-time revenues there. So not something we want to rely on to sustain operations in the long term. In total, the three scenarios, baseline increases about 2.48% annually. The expansion model increases about 4.19%, and the contraction model shows, again, the impact of that recession, drops down 4.6% in the first out year, then a small increase of 1.12%, and then 3.5% thereafter. So impact of the recession early on, and then you see some expansion period after that. So for a point of reference, the forecast is a 5-year model. The last recession took 8 years for us to come back out of that from a revenue standpoint. So goes to show the depth of that 2008 recession, 2009 recession. So here, total major revenues. We see the fiscal year 16-17 slow down, the impact of that. Again, through October, 1% under last year with sales tax, 1% over budget. The fiscal year 17 impact of income tax, probably about $200,000 is what we're looking at right now. And certainly if we're not in some sort of slowdown, it certainly looks that way from our major revenue standpoint. We've seen it flatten, a couple bright spots, a couple of things that we need to keep an eye on, but certainly a slowdown from historical trends. On the expenditure side, salaries included in the forecast. We did include the addition of the Zion contract, about 80% of that in the first out year, and then the remainder after that. Property liability and workers' compensation insurance. The forecast assumes a 5% annual increase. Health insurance, as we talked about, 11% next year, 5% in 2019, and 3% thereafter. Pensions, we know these numbers because we have the actuarial study. Police is up 9.9 next year, and fire is up 2.23. IMRF looks like it's going to come out flat, but we add the communications positions in there for the Zion consolidation, so the total number increases, but the percentage, on a percentage basis, remains pretty flat. Debt service, again, we talked a lot about this last year. Series 2012 used 100% of that for capital. The Series 2009 expires. We're going to repurpose 50% of that for capital and 50% for operations. We have some determinations to make at some point in the future on what to do with the Series 2011 that comes off in 2023, and then the Park District portion that comes off in 2021. So no decisions on those tonight, just something we got to think about in the future if we can do it. We also included in the forecast a debt service for the IEPA loan for the Knowles Road Water Tower. If you remember, that is a low-interest loan, and it should come out to about $325,000 annually. Looking at somewhere between $5 and $5.5 million for that. So, is it included in the forecast? Probably the most important chart in the whole presentation. This chart shows the annual change in fund balance for the three scenarios. Surpluses in the general fund generally run about $1 million. So when we see it dip below that, and that's that red shaded area up there, that's when start to be concerned about the variance, the annual variance. In the expansion model, the green line, in a robust economy, revenue increases outpace expenditures. Baseline model, that's the blue line. Small losses in the near term, nothing that can't be made up pretty easily in budget prep. But long term, personnel costs generally increase more than the long-term average of revenues. So you see that dip down in the out years. And the forecast doesn't include new growth. So new growth is a huge key here. So putting in place the infrastructure to promote new businesses and getting that stuff in place is important. The contraction model, as you can see, again, without adjustments, we're going to have some deficits there moving out. Should we hit a recession somewhere between the magnitude of 2001 and 2008. Again, the forecast is very conservative in its assumptions. Perspective, if we hold the line on non-major operating expenditures, we make up that deficit. So, but again, it's extremely conservative assumptions here. Forecast gives us, again, good direction heading into budget prep. It's supposed to be a long-term model. Any adjustments we make during budget prep will bend all those cost curves up in the out years. And again, new growth here is key. So we really want to bend the cost curves up. That's where it comes from. And we have economic development director position, the EDC things that they do will help us move those cost curves up as far as new growth goes. So we have the infrastructure in place to support and promote that. This slide shows the ending fund balance as a percentage of expenditures and really shows the importance of having the fund balance that we have. We're in a very strong position to maintain operations even without adjustments should we hit a recession. And that's really a testament to the history of conservative fiscal policies and budgeting. Unless we hit a recession and make no adjustments, we will maintain fund balance above the policy. And you can see the red line there shows the recession out in 2021 and 2022 falling below the policy. Again, without any adjustments, conservative. So we're in a very strong position from a fund balance standpoint. On the water and sewer side, there's the water and sewer fund. The forecast includes the rate plan through 2021. We assume a 2% annual drop in water usage, which is the historical trend we've seen. Interestingly enough, this year, according to the JAWA numbers, is up 5% from last year so far. On the expenditure side, everything consistent with the general fund, with the addition of water purchase through JAWA, and then the debt service and the Knowles Road water tower stuff is included in the forecast. On the capital funding side, as we talked about, some of the strategy we put in place last year, draw down all the water and sewer fund balance, transfers from the general fund to water and sewer until the rate picks up and catches up to be able to sustain that capital funding. All that's included in the forecast. One of the things that changed from last year when we looked at our rate model was JAWA increased their projected rate by about 20% or 20 cents in fiscal year 18. So in the short term here, that will have an impact on some of the capital funding, but when we get out to where the water rate, the projected water rate catches up to that big decrease in JAWA, we should have sufficient funding for capital needs there. But something to keep an eye on with, we based some of our projections to be able to fund capital on, obviously, JAWA's charge, and when that changes, it's going to impact our capital plan. This shows the funding in the water and sewer, capital funding in the water and sewer fund. Again, here, if you remember from the Baxter and Women study we talked about last year in 2011, the target here is $2.8 million. When we get out to 2021 and 2022, we see getting near that number, but again, that's not inflation adjusted from 5 years ago. So that has a little bit of an impact. And then the current rate model stops in 2021. So there's when we get out to 2022, it's going to flatten out unless we take action at that time. Looking at the capital fund here, expiring debt service transfers of $250 and then $675. Again, we were able to do that through general fund surpluses last year. General fund surplus of $500,000. That's why the surpluses and conservative budgeting in the general fund is so important, because it has a direct impact on how we fund our capital. And this is non-water and sewer capital. We projected the home rule sales tax that's dedicated to capital at the baseline assumption. So we didn't do an aggressive forecast or a super conservative recessionary forecast. And we also assumed $250,000 in grants annually here. The fire department's been really good, and all departments been really good about seeking out grants and getting some of that stuff. So forecast includes that. Expenses out of here, this projection and this forecast really sets up the funding for the next phase, which is the multi-year capital plan. So this tells us what we have available staff will get together in the next couple weeks and present the capital plan here at the second meeting in December. Through the forecast, fund balance in this fund remains at about $2 million or just above. Again, assuming the surpluses and the transfers, which is why conservative budgeting is so important in the general fund. MFT fund, this fund is dedicated strictly to road resurfacing by statute, about $850,000 annually. We lowered that from last year's forecast due to some of the state issues and probably not getting some of the capital bill funds that we used to get from the state here. Shouldn't have a significant impact on the road program and the capital plan. And the fund balance here stays above $300,000, which is right where we want it to be. There's no reason to have a huge fund balance here because it's a dedicated revenue source. We can only spend it on one thing. So, the 911 fund, a few changes coming for this fund here in the near future, with the consolidation in the joint ETSB boards. We'd like to maintain this fund as a pass-through. How purchases will work with ETSB funds through the joint board is each entity will make a request, will make a purchase and then make a request for reimbursement through the JETSB, call it. That way the JETSB doesn't physically own any property. It's just an independent board. As part of the consolidation, proposing to pay off the Motorola lease that we did for the communications equipment. Last year, pay that off 1 year early. There's requirement for the joining the two ETSB boards to come in debt-free, which I think is reasonable on both sides. And our 911 fund currently has enough funds to pay that off and still bring about $350,000 to the JETSB as startup. So you'll see some more on that when some of the contracts and stuff come forward. Capital funding, one of the major questions we want to answer with the forecast exercise is, can we continue to fund based on the capital plan? And right now it looks like we can. So this slide just puts all those different capital funding mechanisms together. And you can see in fiscal year 18, we're just shy of the capital plan number that was in the capital plan from last year. That's a direct result of the JAWA rate, bringing that down a little bit. So, but for the out years right now, it looks like based on conservative budgeting, having surpluses, being able to meet those targets, we can continue to fund our capital plan. So, kind of wrap up the financial forecast side. Want to maintain the 911 fund as a pass-through, pay off the Motorola lease, have those two, have the consolidation and then into the joint ETSB board, continue conservative budgeting. New services, when we look at adding new services, look for a revenue source for them or corresponding expenditure reductions. Maintain current staffing levels. Obviously, personnel are our greatest asset and also our most expensive as a service organization, so we want to keep that at the right level. And when we look at adding different services, consider alternative staffing models. It may work sometimes, it may not always work, but something we should always consider. And then continue not to rely on one-time revenues. So that wraps up the forecast piece. I was going to talk a little bit about pensions here, so if anybody has any questions.
Questions on the forecast? Trustee Ross?
It's not exactly a question, but on maintaining current staff levels, I think it'd be my preference to keep it or even increase it because customer service is important. And I do understand looking at alternative staffing, but sometimes you don't get the quality and then you get more complaints from residents because the people don't know them as well and that kind of thing. So I would prefer to keep it at, so that we can keep our small town feel.
Yeah, the forecast assumes the current staffing levels throughout. This is more for those non-customer centric services, what we call it.
Okay.
Consider, at least look at some other models that may be able to staff that and still provide the service. But yeah, definitely customer centric services. We want to keep that at a high level.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing to keep in mind when Brian went through this is that, these are based on a really conservative approach and staff making no adjustments during the budget process. So obviously, if we see things are headed to the red before it gets to you, staff is going to make adjustments in expenditures. So that just keep that in mind when you look at this because, it may look a little, not doom and gloom, but not as positive as one may expect. But that's with staff making no adjustments before it gets to you, which obviously would not happen.
I think it's important to note there's no new growth built into the forecast, so it's existing business mix. So obviously, new growth brings with it new revenues and changes the outlook pretty dramatically. So,
And as long as we are talking staffing, where is the police department and fire department in this building? Is the police department up to? 'Cause
They're not fully staffed. They've got 5 vacancies right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, because didn't you just
Had another
in
retirement.
the discussion that they were done, so that's why they had that money, just because?
Yeah, well, I mean, right, they've got retirements I go through, and it takes some time to fill those officer positions, and then the new employee, if it's entry level, or, you know, they come in at a lower salary, so you have those savings. So I know they've just about exhausted the entry level list that they thought would last until next October it was supposed to last, and they're almost out of people on that. So right now, we're accepting applications for lateral applicants, and instead of waiting until a set date and time to take a look at those, they're looking at them as they come in to try to speed up that process. So they've got 5 positions open right now that they're trying to fill. Fire department is fully staffed.
And in both public works and admin?
We're fully
yeah,
staffed.
I think everybody's fully staffed.
Yeah, everyone's fully staffed except for the police department right now.
Okay.
And that's a constant over there, unfortunately.
Thank you.
All right, talk a little bit about pensions here. How are they funded? And some of the numbers you see up there are from the last actuary report, and I'll explain them a little bit better. But they're funded by 3 different things: investment returns, employee contributions, which are set by state statute, and employer contributions, which we determine through an independent actuarial study. Some of that is set by state statute as well. So if you look at the employer contributions are really the balancing act here. So investment returns, and on the slide I show investment returns from last year, police $280,000, fire $1.5 million. The year prior to that, it was the reverse. So it fluctuates with investment strategies and with the economy. The year before that, the police were at $4.2 million. The fire department was at $1.3 million. So it's going to fluctuate based on the strategy of the investment advisors and what at that point in time, what the economy looks like and the markets look like. From an actuary standpoint, they look at investment returns smoothed over 5 years. So if we had a really bad year from an investment return standpoint, that would be smoothed over 5 years to smooth out that employer contribution. We're not going to take that full hit. Important to note that pensions are a long-term view of all this stuff. So when you look at investment returns in any one given year, it's important to look at them in the context of, say, a 5 or 10-year average. In any single 1 year, it's just a point in time. So last year, so those 3 things make up the funding requirement. And last year, if you recall, we changed some actuaries to get a better handle on the funding requirement and how that's made up. And I got a little slide here. So the village funding strategy is on the left side, and the state statute requirement is on the right. If you remember, in 2011, there was some pension relief bill that went through in Illinois that allowed municipalities to fund at a lower level. Some municipalities took advantage of it. Some didn't. The village did not. We continued to fund at the conservative level. A couple points here. The village's strategy is based on funding it at being 100% funded by 2040. The state requirement was reduced to 90% back in 2011. The village's strategy is based on what's called entry age normal. So you start funding future benefits right away as soon as they walk in the door. The idea is to keep it at a level percentage of payroll throughout that period. The state requirement went to what's called a projected unit cost, which allowed you to, I don't want to say short, but pay more at the end of somebody's career for their benefit than at the beginning. So it kind of pushed it off a little bit here and provided some, intention was to provide some short-term relief. The investment assumption is set by us, used in both models, but you can see the impact of being conservative has on our funded status. The police 64.71, fire 67.87. If we run all the actuarial numbers based on what we're required under the state statute minimum requirement, we're funded at police 76.56 and fire at 85.52. So from a funded status percentage standpoint, being conservative brings that down a little bit. But when you get out to near 2040, you're going to be in a much, much better position by being conservative on the front end of that. And the 2040 is set by state statute as well, and that was moved in 2011 from 2033 to 2040. So the closer you get to that point, I would imagine the state will take similar action and push it out a few more years. But so that's kind of what goes into the funding of how the actuarial assumptions come out. There's a lot more into it than that, but those are the big things. The important thing to note is that the village funds on a much more conservative level than is required by state statute, which direction is we want to continue to do, and it makes good fiscal sense to do that. So, any questions on pensions before I move into the fiscal contingency plan? Just want to do like a brief kind of overview on what goes into that. I know we've had some questions at different times on the quarterly reports and stuff. Looking at the fiscal contingency plan, there was a draft in the material. When we looked at this, some things came out from the GFOA, and it made sense for towns that don't levy a property tax and are relying on economically sensitive revenues to look at something like this. So that's why I brought it forward. It is a GFOA best practice. They adopted it as a best practice to have one of these. So I wanted to start with just the definition of what contingency is. Obviously here, this is from Investopedia. It's just a potential negative event. And the bottom piece there is, to mitigate that risk, finance managers will put into place on the conservative side, assuming slightly worse than expected outcomes, which we build into the forecast, and arranging the village's financials so that it can weather any negative outcome with the least distress possible. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is maintain the vital services, maintain some of the things we put out as priority in the strategic plan, even in the event of an economic downturn. And then the last bullet point there is just minimize the loss and damage from an unforeseen event. So the purpose of the plan here is to put together a framework and a strategy to respond to fiscal stress or adverse fiscal conditions in the short and long term, depending on the duration of what the event is. Have reactions based on a plan versus a knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes the repercussions from knee-jerk reactions take a while to reverse or correct. Also in the plan, maintain organizational principles and values, the stuff laid out in the strategic plan while we respond to those adverse conditions. Maintain vital services, continue to fund capital and infrastructure. The plan focuses primarily on expenditures. There's a few revenue options as well, but as far as the plan and the actions that we would take, it focuses primarily on the expenditure side. And there's really two parts to it. Plan. I mean, we call it a plan, but it's really like almost a policy piece, and then a plan that is maintained kind of at the staff level that's reviewed during the budget process, and we'll get into that a little bit. So what it's not is a specific detailed instruction in the policy piece. We don't want to have in policy something that would cause anxiety amongst employee groups. If you do that, things are not taken seriously, and the needs and priorities change constantly of what we're looking to do. So, why we need it? Economically sensitive revenues. We don't levy a property tax here, so you can see 75% of all general funds revenues are sensitive to economic fluctuations. Who's involved in the plan? The policy piece of it, which you have in front of you, approved by the village board. Administrator is responsible for adhering and enforcement. Finance director creates and monitors at the plan level. Again, we'll do that in conjunction with the department heads through the annual budget process, and make recommendations to the administrator, and there's some reporting requirements and things that come in there to the village board. For the department head side, it's maintain a list and annually review a list of potential actions that could be taken in the event of an economic downturn and a substantial interruption in revenues or resources. The plan includes what's called a trigger event. If a trigger event happens, then during the fiscal year, the administrator determines what measures are appropriate, and again, we do this in conjunction with the department heads. The measures will be taken in a manner, at least according to the policy side, that will uphold the village's strategic plan while recognizing benefits as quickly as possible. So we want to look at things that have the least impact on operations, and we can realize the benefits quickly. We want to look at those first versus something that has a huge impact on the strategic plan and takes a while to implement. So the triggers included in kind of the policy piece of it. Any adverse fiscal circumstances determined by the village administrator. So this is stuff like natural disasters, things that aren't triggered by a financial metric. The financial metric piece of it is any two consecutive fiscal quarters of decline in total major revenues, so 75% of our general fund revenues from the prior year, and a negative variance from the annual budget. So when we were putting this together and looking at other, different documents and what the GFOA direction was, I looked at the last time 2 consecutive fiscal quarters were in decline, and it was 2009, so our fiscal year 10, and the last 2 quarters. Now, the last 2 quarters we actually planned for through the budgeting process because we had seen things flattening out at the end of last year, so we have a positive budget variance, but a negative from the prior year actual. So it would not trigger an event here. So we wanted to get somewhere where we see a decline in revenues from prior year actuals and something we didn't already anticipate. So that would be something that would trigger the event or trigger action and reporting. Some of the measures we talked about, determined and maintained by departments, updated annually in conjunction with the annual budget process, categorized based on impact to the strategic plan, strategic direction, and how quickly we can realize the impact. And this is just a sample, illustrative purposes only, a sample matrix of how that works. Really, actions are broken down into 3 tiers. If you look on the vertical axis, it's impact to the mission, strategic plan, and then on the horizontal axis, it's time to realize the benefit from the short term to the long term. And actions are really broken down into 3 tiers. What can we do quickly, least impact, what has some impact, and how quickly can we get that, and then obviously tier 3, the greatest impact, which obviously we don't want to get to that point. So example, some things that would happen in the tier 1 would be insource some things. We have some contracts, for example, finance has an accounting contract that we could bring in-house, short-term, save that kind of money. Non-essential capital vehicles and equipment we could push off a year, some things like that. So something we could realize quickly, budget savings in this year, and have a very little to no impact on operations. When you get to tier 2, you're looking at, again, contracts, maybe reducing some contracts. If you look at like tree trimming contracts, street sweeping, mosquito abatement contracts, things like that, just reducing those things, holding off on vehicles, or maybe even leasing vehicles short term, something like that. And then looking at, on the revenue side, there's only a couple revenue options here, but looking at charges for services, there's something that maybe we're really off with, surrounding communities. And then tier 3 obviously gets into some things that I can't even imagine a scenario where we would get into this. But a couple things here that we could do is longer term side, some legislative advocacy. Again, back in 2011, there were some towns that advocated for some pension relief and things like that. But here you get into some really impactful things here. So it seems like when you look at that stuff, it seems like it's common sense. It's stuff we do now. But really, by putting it into policy, we've set a couple directions. We said annually, we will discuss these options at the staff level in preparation with the budget. We'll keep a list together so we can react quickly if we need to. We've gotten formal direction in the policy on how to identify and some reporting requirements should a trigger event happen, should we find ourselves in the recession or in some sort of adverse fiscal condition. We've got formal direction on the sequence of adjustments. Obviously, lowest impact, quickest realization of the benefits first. But I think one of the most important things is it says, particularly to the rating agencies, we know that this is a possible weakness and we're susceptible to economic fluctuations, and we have a plan and we're ready for it. And then, of course, it coordinates the response in conjunction with the strategic plan principles and the direction that was laid out in that document. So from the actual plan standpoint and those actions that will happen on the staff level, go through that discussion during the budget preparation process. You know, we can certainly share in the meetings with trustees one-on-one, but it's not something we want to put in the policy document. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. The next steps are taking the funding direction from the forecast, putting that into the multi-year capital plan, and coming back to the board with a plan for 5 years capital spending here in late December.
Very comprehensive and good work, because I think next year we're going to have to adjust the sales, so to say, based on bond market and everything else what's going on, and it'll be challenging when we get into the budget year, but they're having a roadmap makes those decisions not more pleasant, but at least, you know, we're not knee-jerking like you said, so.
But where is it, the sales tax, where, I'll think of it, get it all out, this, on internet sales, where is that at? Where is the government?
It's never been called, it's never gotten out of committee, and there was no change in Congress, so I don't think we can anticipate it getting passed anytime soon.
I think from a legislative standpoint, it's nowhere.
Yeah, the Marketplace Fairness Act, yeah, and I saw that today's they predict that the online sales was 17% higher than last year for the weekend, so that just cuts in more. But yeah, after the election results, there's really no chance of that getting passed.
I obviously hadn't been over the border in a long time. That building that Amazon.
Yeah, it's huge.
That's
yeah.
huge.
Yeah, I think.
Question.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. No. When we have an incident, when we have flooding, what does that cost us, and do we get any of that back through a federal? Do you have?
If it's declared a disaster for public aid, there's like level A through G or whatever, and then we throw in with the county, and so we get some of it back.
Yeah, we've applied, like the mayor said, when FEMA or IEMA declares it a disaster and those funds become available. I know John Kavanaugh has led up those grant applications. We've had it for flooding once or twice since I've been here, and then I know we've had it for a snow event or two since I've been here too, where they've declared it a disaster, and he's been able to take all the man hours and equipment hours and the commodities and throw all that together and get some of that back. Otherwise, when it floods, I mean, that's just, you know, those hours are hours that were budgeted, any supplies that we need. I mean, they spend them out of their general operating funds. So
I mean, that's part of your contingency.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point that I didn't mention when we were going through that matrix. Is obviously our first line of defense is fund balance. So, you know, that's why you have fund balance. You know, for things just like that, short term that even could be reimbursed, or just short term fluctuations. You know, that's obviously the first step. So, I mean, I mentioned some things that we could do from an operations standpoint, but obviously, any short term event fund balance is our first layer of protection.
And by those recommended, 75% of our budget, is it 75% or is it 80%?
no, 75% of our major revenues. I mean, 75% of our budget is those 8 revenue categories that are economically sensitive. So I mean, we've got a lot of our eggs in one basket. So, like Brian said, I mean, coming up with a list of you know, items that would have to be cut is something that we do every year. It's been more informal in previous years. This will formalize the process and then just have it on everybody's radar as staff goes through the budget preparation process. That's just one of the pieces that they need to pull out that list and take a look at it and make adjustments, so that it's there at the ready in case, you know, we see things heading south, like the mayor said, so it's not knee-jerk, so that the departments are, at least management staff is prepared for it and they know what steps they'll have to take. So
And I don't think it'll be once you go through the exercise once, and we just did it in 2011 with the income tax for a couple years ago, not 2011. It's not going to take much to update it every year, so it's not going to be this huge, arduous task during budget prep for departments. It's going to be confirming, is there anything that we've done in the last year that we can add or take away or things like that. So it's not going to, it's going to be very little maintenance, I think, year to year. But I think it'll be valuable when something happens.
It's a good exercise to think
Yeah.
through.
Right.
The last couple of years, we drew down some of our fund balances because there was things we wanted to get done. Just seeing how some of the economic policies may play out, this would be, I already said to Patrick, we need to conserve cash until we kind of see, because a lot of this stuff is going to hurt us locally if we get into inflation and that, which is pretty probable right now.
Yeah, there's definitely
So,
a rate increase.
that the
that's
first thing that gets hit is consumer spending. So if we conserve cash, then we get through this without any tax increases or new
Yeah.
revenues or anything.
Component of that.
So, which is why we keep such a strong
Yeah.
fund balance.
Yeah, the fund balances that we've drawn down, I mean, those have been those ones that are really
Yeah, those smaller ones.
pigeonholed, that you can only spend them on certain stuff. The general fund balance, we've been adding money to, not drawing it down, so.
Yeah, I think we were at 72 and we went to 70, which was pretty risque for us.
Yeah, we spent a little bit one year on some
yeah,
capital,
yeah,
but it's been
but-
built back up and it's surpassed
Yeah.
that now.
So I think right now, knowing what we know or what some of the proposed economic policies are, we should be in a conserve cash mode. Trustee Wilson.
I was going to say thank you very much for having the contingency plan in there, because I know me as a trustee, and I'm sure everyone else here, makes you feel even more at ease knowing that there's a plan, and thank you for sharing it so that we know where we would go. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, like Brian said.
I know a lot of work went into this. Thank you.
Yeah, Brian did a great job on this. I mean, this is all him putting this stuff together. So while he's trying to work on the munis implementation, so he's been pretty busy lately. So like he said, next up is multi-year capital plan, and we had that set for, was that December 19th?
Second meeting, I think it's the
Yeah,
19th.
so December 19th, we'll have the multi-year capital plan, so Scott will be here.
Yeah, we might want to fix some water mains on Grand Avenue.
Yeah, there's a couple spots that
I
are
know, they keep repetitive.
currently shut off because there's breaks, and we've got the contract awarded. We just haven't got been able to get the contractor here yet, so that was just a recent award, so that would have helped, but yes, I agree.
Any word on when the kids are going back to school?
Not tomorrow.
Yeah,
They
but-
announced that they're
My
not going to open
15-year-old
tomorrow.
was
I know.
sadly
I know.
I know, but the elementary school's open.
Dr.
so-
Hutton kept him over here, and when I went to go get my kids, he had trash bags over the water fountains to keep the kids from drinking out of it, so apparently Dr. Algram can't trust the high schoolers to tear through the
No, I
garbage
think
bags or
theirs was the
something, so-
food, I
No,
think the food
it's the food
preparation
prep,
was the
so-
bigger issue for them.
Yeah, they thought at the earliest the boil order would be lifted would be tomorrow evening, so he's got school closed tomorrow. So hopefully they'll be back to normal on Wednesday.
Mayor or Pat, can I ask two questions?
Yes.
And I'll make them small and fast. So I think, Brian, you were talking about the income tax on page 8, or the slide 8, where you were saying that there's an IML inquiry open on that?
Yep.
So when I look at the detail in the big book you gave us on page 21, so is the inquiry to the state? Can you give it, I mean, it's
Yeah,
down
so-
so significantly. I'm not sure I'm understanding what is it that they're questioning if the state is handling it right?
Yes, IML sent out some correspondence to municipalities, 2 weeks ago, maybe,
Yeah,
somewhere in
the
that
last
time
couple
frame,
weeks.
saying that, a lot of people rely on our forecast for income tax, which a lot of municipalities use that as kind of their budget guide. And we're down significantly from where we thought it would be. And we've opened up an inquiry with the IDOR. We're in talks with them, and we hope to get a response.
So,
It's paid out per capita, so everyone is feeling this across
Right.
the state.
Right.
And the IML has,
everyone that bases their assumptions on IML.
Yeah, and IML is not usually this far off.
and like Brian said, IML comes out with a per capita rate that they recommend municipalities use, and we are more conservative than that. So if they came out at $100 per head, we'd budget like 90 or 95.
Okay, that was
And we're
my
still down
question is,
12.5%.
How did we look compared to our last year's budget for this? Did we stay with our same assumptions, and therefore that gives you an indication that something is out of whack?
No. So what we did this year for the budget was took the IML assumption, and I think it was around 100 actually, and I think we went to 95.
Yeah.
I think we were about 5% under what they had forecast for that. But As far as in the forecast, how we assume at some point this drop is going to get resolved. And we didn't project that to continue out in the forecast. Now, clearly, in the next immediate budget year, there could be an impact that we definitely have to consider. Hopefully, we have an answer before then. But at this point, it's municipalities across the state are waiting for the IDOR to say something.
Okay, thanks. The other quick question is on that use tax, since Jeannie brought it up. On page 8 in your slide, you said that it was up 3.5% year from last year. And then in the big book, on page 31, it says that Amazon actually voluntarily does collect and give to us.
But not the home rule
So,
portion.
yes, so a couple points I wanted to make when Jeannie was talking about earlier was, so Amazon voluntarily collects it and remits it to the state, and this is, again, distributed based on a per capita basis. So it's not people within Gurnee buying from Amazon and then we get it back. And as part of their voluntary remittance, they said, we can't keep track of who's got home rule and who doesn't, so we're just going to do it based on the state rate and submit it back to the state, and then the state disperses it as use tax. So we're missing out of the home rule on that one, and it's distributed per capita.
Okay.
So I don't know if, sorry, did that answer?
No, I think that helps, but I guess, so when, like the mayor had said that the recent online for Black Friday was stated to be 17% year-over-year increase, so at least we might be heading in the right direction. I know 3.5% is small, but wouldn't that be a multiple?
We certainly could see a boost, but not all online retailers are voluntarily collecting and remitting.
Right.
And without the home rule, which is really, it funds capital and is in lieu of a property tax, but it's better than nothing. I mean, Amazon's trying.
Right.
It's hard to believe that it can ship packages all over the world in 24 hours, but they can't figure out home rule sales tax. But
Thank you, and again, good job to everybody involved in this.
Sure, thank you.
This is fantastic details.
it is. It's going to make March much easier, because by then we'll have some idea of which policies federally go into effect and which ones don't.
And with the fiscal contingency plan, we'll look to formalize that with the budget process. There's some other financial policies that as soon as I find out the full impact of munis and how that'll change procedure stuff, we're going to bring those forward. So we can do it all in conjunction with that.
Excellent. Any questions or?
I just have a comment.
Go ahead.
With you saying that it took 8 years to get over the last recession, it would be nice to have 8 years where we would just keep going up instead of having to worry about this now.
Ain't going to happen now.
Yeah, interesting. When we
That
were
horse left the barn.
and we were talking about this today. We're in the longest growth period in history since they've been tracking recessions anyway. It's been slow, but as far as in between recessions, this is the longest one on record. So.
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't feel that it was
Right.
recovery until maybe just
Yeah,
this
well.
week.
They're in for a world of hurt. I'm betting on inflation, just based on the bond market. All right. We don't normally have public comment, but since we have some public here, was there something on the agenda that you were interested in or that you wanted to comment on? Okay. All right. Then if there's nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Motion by trustee Ballman, second by trustee Thorstenson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right.